The raid is almost done, and the meta has kind of changed now that everybody has cleared Farok, because the meta for the DPS kind of factors into the highest difficulty of the content that you can do. Some naughty little warlocks have been busy trying to increase their overall rankings in the tier lists by padding on some ads. You know who you are, but enough about that. Let's hit it off. Frostnet Knight has had quite a ride in Amirdrassil, and it continuously has a ride that it goes on in terms of its overall performance, because some of the best Frost Death Knights out there are smashing it so much so that I feel like it belongs in A tier, but some of them kind of like failed. It always has the situation, I'm gonna put it into B tier, it always has the situation where it can do really well or really poorly based on the uptime on the boss. Pretty much everybody and their mom is playing Obliteration right now. There's no room for Breath of Sindragosa whatso freaking ever, and Frost Death Knight is around B tier. If you want to take an overall look at damage in terms of the raid, Arcane.gg kind of has their own little ways of representing data in their little tier list. We're not going to be creating a tier list that way because that doesn't have the complete picture, but you can see Frost DK is ranked over there in A tier in overall in the raid. It's not quite A tier because it's only looking, the tier list seems to be generated just by pure raw DPS, but at least we know that Frost DK can do a lot of DPS, which is very important, but it takes a while to get to learning how to properly play Frost DK in some of these last raids, and that's probably why it's climbing. But learning is important. Learning how to play a bunch of specs in the raid is fun, but can be a challenge if you don't know what to improve. Today's sponsor, Outplayed, helps you with it just as it did for us. Outplayed is a recording software, free to get, easy to install, and seamless to use. When you record a fight of any kind, you can check it afterwards and clip it. This is particularly useful when you want to check if you did your rotation correctly, which is easier by sharing that clip with your friends or guildies that can look over what you did and educate you on what to improve. Simply clipping it and clicking the share icon for the social media platform of your choice, all in a matter of seconds, which is also exactly how long it takes to install it. Check the link in the description to get Outplayed free and fast, and support Marcelian&Online as well. Thank you, Outplayed, for sponsoring this video. As you've probably seen from the prior ranking picture that we just put on screen, you know that Unholy is doing really well. Unholy is doing better than really well. Actually, it's doing incredible at the moment, especially if you look at, let's say, some of the tougher bosses going to the raid. We're gonna first of all put Unholy into A tier. It's very close to being S tier, by the way. I'm not sure if it's going to make S tier by the end of the season, which is probably going to be fairly close, but going into season 4, I don't doubt that Unholy is going to be a very strong contender for a top dog, top pick DPS spec, which is great coming from the journey that it had in 10.0 where it was king, and then it dropped in 10.1, and now it's kind of back in 10.2, but it took a while, took a couple of months for it to get here. Unholy obviously is really good and has some really incredible fights, and specifically we're looking at Laradar's overall damage because that's when the raid kind of starts to get a little bit tougher, and all of the data and analysis is obviously from the whole raid, but in terms of how we decide to put these specs into different tiers is based on the last couple of well, not couple of bosses, but starting with Laradar, Nimue, Smolderon, Tindril, and Farok. Those are the harder bosses in Mythic, and because up to that, pretty much everybody can do a lot of damage, and they're doing pretty well. And you'll even see some like fairly even distribution of performance across some of the higher bosses past Laradar as well. So things are looking really good, but I know people like to see specs being ranked high or being ranked low. A, B tiers are usually the boring tiers for people, but those are the specs that are actually really well designed and balanced. Moving forward to Havoc, also a particularly difficult spec to rank, because Havoc right now, if we look at pretty much every Farok situation, overall damage is crazy. For Havoc just does really well on Farok, and just because of that, I would normally put it into S tier. However, across the raid, there's a different story being told by Havoc, and especially if we look at boss damage. For instance, Tindril sees Havoc in terms of boss damage really low. It's very hard to do a lot of that boss damage on Tindril, of course, because you know, there's all the transition, all the mechanics that you have to do, but it is one of the gatekeeping bosses that you need to defeat to move forward, and that kind of takes it down a peg. Because Havoc is one of the best overall DPSers on Farok, I will put it into A tier, a little bit behind Unholy, which is weird because Havoc overall is probably... I would have thought it would have been a better DPS spec period than Unholy. Actually, I would have expected it to be on S tier. And if we really only look at Farok fights, and if we only judge DPS specs based on Farok, it probably is an S tier spec. But we're not just looking at Farok. We're looking at overall the entire raid. Because if you are playing a Havoc and you are progressing with your guild, if you're already at Farok, the tiers doesn't matter. But if you're like trying to get a sense of how the spec performs overall across the raid, because the raid is not just Farok, then it's probably B to A tier. But I'm gonna give it A tier because it's a unique spec that brings a lot of benefit, and a couple of bad fights aren't enough to like put it down a peg, considering the Havoc was consistently very good the entire tier, not just the meta that we have now. Moving forward to Balanced Druid, my former main, is... It's kind of similar to Havoc, where it has its ups and downs. I'm gonna put it into B tier. Now, I don't know if it's better than Frost DK or not. Probably on some fights. It does have a lot of boss damage. It struggles a lot on ad fights, since as we all know, Balance does have to go through a lot of redotting, reapplying dot, starting to cast, moving, especially on Farok. You do have the range, and depending on your positioning, you do have potential to do a lot of damage, especially to the ads. But the redotting, the redodging, the probably going into groups to getting AoE healed by everybody else is probably gonna take a little while. While, for instance, other specs, other casters might have an easier time, but overall casters don't really have an easy time in the raid period, since the meta is most likely going to be dominated by melee, and we will see that as we go forward. However, there are particular bosses where Balance is doing really good. Once again, we can take a look at the overall raid boss damage. Like if we look at how Warcraft logs distribute specs based on their overall boss damage, not just ad damage, we see Balance above average in the top half of the DPS performance, as with all the other specs as well. Sometimes ads are very important, and we know that on Council, Balance slaps very hard, but Council is usually an easy boss, an annoying boss, but an easy boss. So Balance is just okay. It's good. At the very most, it's B tier, but that's what we're gonna see Balance so far. Moving into Feral. Feral is actually way better. Feral has a lot of issues, of course, and just because it has been used on Race World first doesn't mean it's S tier, although it is very good, and it is one of the best boss damage specs in the game, and that definitely does matter. And I'm going to emphasize boss damage throughout this tier list a lot because we'll get to Affliction, and you probably know what I'm talking about if you've been playing Affliction, but boss damage is important. And now that we get late into the season, late into the end, people pad a lot of the damage. So unless we play all 26 DPS specs at Mythic Cutting Edge level, which we don't, to have personal insight on all of this, we can only look at the data. And the data is always going to be skewed because a lot of people pad, a lot of people, play with, a lot of buffs being funneled into them to parse to get that rank 1 on specific bosses, where everybody in their raid is basically augmenting their own experience to facilitate one person having rank 1. That's not normal. That's not what you do in a raid. That's what the 0.1% people are. I don't know how many people are actually able to do this. But if we take that all out of the equation, Feral is actually really, really, really good. Like on Nimue, for instance, where there's no pad, Feral is S tier. If we look at the overall damage distribution, especially on Archon.gg, it's S tier there with Red and Sub, but it is a really good fight. And it's a difficult fight because the damage is pretty important, especially with the ads. The faster that it dies, the faster you transition, the less damage everybody else takes, the easier the fight is. It's not an amazingly difficult fight, but it is kind of like a barrier that people have to go through. And it does have some low points. Like if you want to look at the overall Farok DPS performance, Feral is really, really low. It has similar to Balance, as we see that both of them are kind of like at the bottom of the list. They have a very hard time dealing with ads because you dot ads. Your Primal Wrath, if you do play Primal Wrath, and you're likely not going to because it's a bad way to play on Farok, you still have to have the ads kind of clumped up, and that's a rare situation. Hence why if you just look at the overall damage, you see, oh my god, Feral C tier, Feral is a bad spec. Not really. If you look at the boss damage, the damage to Farok, which is actually what matters, I'm gonna see it crank, which is why it's kind of right next to Havoc, because Havoc seems to be doing better at the other opposite thing, where it just has really accessible damage to ads without having to augment its playstyle and lose a lot of boss damage or have a particularly difficult time trying to get to ads. Devastation is... it's kind of like a middle of the pack. Devastation is kind of B tier-ish. It's okay. It does a lot of damage. It has some fights where it excels at, especially if we look at Nimue once again. Similar to Feral, it has really, really good damage on the Nimue fight, which is once again a difficult fight to get through. But it starts to drop off a little bit later, where on Smolderon, for instance, it kind of drops to C tier. I can only imagine its cooldowns don't align really well with the vulnerability phase, which I am familiar with as an Assassination Rogue as well. Not having cooldowns with the vulnerability phase on Smolderon is really going to tank a lot of your performance on it. And when it comes to actual boss damage on Tindril, for instance, it's still at pretty much the bottom of the barrel, close to the bottom of the barrel. But outside of that, Devastation is a pretty good spec. It has really good performance overall. It's very mobile. It brings, you know, value to the raid if you don't have an augmentation, and you know, everybody has an augmentation, okay? But that's where we're gonna put Devastation for now. Beastmaster is going to be put all the way into A tier. Another very controversial spec to rank, because depending on when you look or who you listen to, Beastmaster seems to have fallen off. It didn't really fall off. It has really good boss damage. It has really good AoE. Problem is that it's in a similar boat as Feral, and we're gonna see that trend in A tier, where if you want that boss damage to kill the boss, you're probably going to sack pretty much all of your AoE. You don't really have multi-shot and beast cleave of value if you do play into giga boss damage. Hence why on Frog, on Tindril, on actually not Smolderon, you're not gonna have overall big damage, but that's not what matters, right? But where it matters, BM delivers, and that's where it is. Marksmanship, also semi-controversial, because people think it's way worse than it actually is. It's not that bad. It's actually surprisingly decent. B tier is decent. Remember, all of these specs have cleared Mythic Frog, which you cannot clear Mythic Frog by being dog shit, right? That usually happens in the first couple of weeks. But now Marksmanship seems to be doing really well, and it does have a surprising amount of boss damage. It once again struggles with AoE once you try to build it towards killing the boss quicker, which is something that we see a lot with a lot of the specs. Marksmanship is no different. For instance, if we look at Farok overall distribution of performance, Marksmanship is ranked as A tier. Now, once again, I don't see it necessarily all the way into A tier, because on fights like Smolderon, it's B tier, and we see, by the way, BM being really good on Smolderon as well, just as an FYI, and on Tindril into B tier as well. So overall, you can kind of say, and Tindril is like, you know, it's Tindril. You can pad a lot if you want to, but even with the pad, it's has other competitors there. Overall, I think B tier is a safe spot to put Marksmanship in. Survival is a similar story to Marksmanship. If we look at kind of the same fights where Marksmanship excels, it seems like Survival also excels as well. It's doing overall good. It kind of struggles with overall performance, however, because it still maintains, and it's probably a situation with its current design of the talents. To do a lot of damage in AoE, you have to really swap your talent build around, or to swap your overall performance around, and you sacrifice boss damage. But if we look at the boss damage, especially on Farok, Survival is actually duking it out with the top specs there, doing some of the best amount of boss damage, which is really important for Farok, since once you are geared enough to actually get to Mythic Farok, likely everybody has just natural cleave, like Havoc Demon Hunters, where it just kills ads without too much worry. So ads on Frog don't usually become a major issue, but pushing Frog through those phases does, especially, you know, in the shield / orbs coming in phase. That usually sucks a lot. So the more damage you have for a single target, the better the spec is. Arcane Mage is also a B tier spec, pretty standard. Once again, it has fights where it excels quite a bit. For instance, if we look at Larodar, it's currently ranked as the best spec in terms of overall DPS there. Probably natural cleave out there with Touch of the Magi. I don't really, to be fair, I don't really see trees being a big issue on Laradar almost ever. Like even when we struggled with clearing the trees on our first week, after a couple of weeks, those would become like a non-issue. They just die so quick. And I'm using our guild as an example because we actually struggled with AoE, or what other people call pad. But pad isn't exactly what's happening here. It's a lot of boss damage, and most likely Laradar is a difficult boss to have a lot of boss damage on, because, you know, the boss keeps charging away. Arcane seems to be doing pretty well. It's probably has a lot of flexibility in adjusting its little burst, little burn phases when Laradar is currently up, which is really good. That's a good fight essentially for Arcane. And overall in the raid, in terms of its overall boss damage potential, it is slightly above middle of the pack, which is why I decided to keep it into B tier. It's where the specs that do really well go, but are not essentially excelling at all of the fights. For instance, on Smolderon, Arcane is around A tier, still better than the majority of the specs, but not the same for essentially Tindril, for instance, where it starts to drop off a little bit. Uptime on the boss tends to become an issue, and you see some of the weaknesses of some of these specs. Fire Mage has been I mean, I want to say it's been rising. I don't know where we had it last time, but it didn't really seem like Fire Mage was a particularly amazing spec in a raid. It is A tier, because similar to Arcane, it has some particularly good fights. Overall, it's doing way better than Arcane. It does have some fights where it's kind of like squeaking a little bit in terms of the damage that it does. But priority damage for Fire Mage has never been a particular issue. And with the way that its Ignite spread works, I don't know how many people use Ignite spread to actually play, but, you know, once again, we look at Laradar, it's one of the S tier specs on Laradar, and it has way more fights within the raid where it does a little bit better than Arcane, which is why it's a tier higher than Arcane. Frost Mage is also a very peculiar spec to rank, because overall on Farok, it is, I think it's S tier? Yes. On Farok, in terms of overall performance, people do put it into S tier. It does a lot of Farok damage overall. In terms of the boss damage, not as much. It sees quite a dip in terms of damage to the actual boss, which is why I decided to not put it into A tier close to fire, but put it all the way at the bottom, because it just doesn't do that much damage to the boss. Sure, you need AoE, sure, you need the ads to die, but that's, you know, they will die. They will die nonetheless. And that's, you know, why it's around B tier. Still really good, but if you want to look at the overall damage output that it can bring, if you look at just the DPS meters, probably you can put Frost Mage into A tier. Windwalker is also fairly standard. It's going to go into B tier. It has bosses where it does really well, and a lot of bosses where it surprisingly still suffers. For instance, on Smolderon, you only have boss damage there, and if we look at where it's ranking overall with Arcane.gg DPS spread, it's all the way at the bottom, and that's a particular boss where I don't want to say it's easy to do boss damage on, but you do just have the boss and you don't really have to move a lot. I mean, I guess it depends on the strategy of each guild. The majority of the strategies on killing Smolderon with melees pretty much are on the boss as much as they can possibly be, right? Outside of the boss pushing you back so you can generate the little orbs to pick them up, you pretty much have 100% uptime on the boss, as much as any other DPS. So it's not like Windwalker suffers more because of uptime, and still, with all of that, it still doesn't push as high as other specs do, while on Tindril is also pretty low. It's kind of C tierish with a lot of other specs. Tindril is also a very difficult boss fight to rank specs on. A lot of S tier specs are down in the shitter on Tindril, and that's kind of hard to rank them because they excel at Farok. It has a lot of fights where it does a lot of like very poor boss damage. On Farok overall, it does do a little bit well. It's ranked all the way into A tier. We're not going to put it into A tier here, but just because it does overall good on Farok, since we talk about all of these specs that need to do a lot of boss damage, some specs don't really have the option to just focus a lot on a lot of boss damage. They have some natural cleave. Once again, specs like Havoc and Windwalker, which you see how they're doing a little bit better on Farok compared to the other bosses, is why we're also going to have Windwalker around B tierish and not A tier or C tier, because that discrepancy is way too high. So having it like middle of the pack seems to be overall smarter. Ret is weird because Ret is S tier. This is freaking blowing my mind. Obviously, we've been having Ret S tier for a while last time as well, so it's not a big surprise. It didn't really change. Well, I guess some specs kind of climbed and some specs kind of dropped. Ret maintained its position. Overall, Ret has changed. It was kind of like a Windwalker story where AoE burst was its thing. Now after the buffs, well, a couple of months ago after the buffs, it's been getting a lot of single target damage, and you see it excel at boss damage, which is something that you really want. You have some AoE. Fortunately for Ret, you don't lose Divine Storm by going Giga into the single target build, where you actually excel. And you see Ret on Farok, for instance, it's ranked 8 here, but if you look at the boss damage, it's among the kings. And if you look at overall in the raid, boss damage is the second best spec in the game at dealing damage to the boss, which is 100% what you want. And if Ret, let's say X immobile spec can do this, you know that the damage is really good. Not to mention the flexibility of its cooldown can align it really well with a lot of the boss mechanics. Like on Smolder Run, it's around 8 here. Sure, you probably don't want to hold your cooldowns in any way. Not sure if you have to on Smolder Run. I think Ret, I haven't played Ret on Smolder Run on Mythic yet, but I believe Ret has at least something for every vulnerability phase, because it's not, the vulnerability phase doesn't seem to happen every minute. I would know because my Kingsbane is not up for every vulnerability phase, but it does do a lot of damage. It just compensates by being incredibly consistent. Shadow Priest is also up and down depending on the fights. It's very close to 8 tier, and I kind of want to put it into 8 tier, but I want to judge the spec on its own merits, because if we think about the value of power infusion that it brings, it's probably 8 tier. But I do want to look at Shadow Priest just as it is and what it does right now. Overall, in the raid, in terms of raid boss damage, it's above average. It's in the upper echelon, so you know it has good damage. Not to mention that it has really good execute. I think we're aware with the tier set that Shadow just destroys low HP bosses. Low HP targets in general. There are some ads, like probably it works really well for Shadow that the Colossus can be just nuked down on Farok when they get particularly low. There are, you know, fights like Smolder Run where it suffers a little bit. It's around B tier-ish, kind of bottom to B tier. Dangerously close to C tier, I would say, on Smolder Run. And on Tindril, also not doing too hot either. I would imagine that, well, this is kind of why I want to judge it on its own. Sure, Power Infusion is a group benefit, but also is Mass Dispel. And whether or not you use Power Infusion on somebody else, you'll still use Mass Dispel, which I imagine it's pretty good on Tindril as well, even though the damage is so low, which is why I'm not putting Shadow into actual C tier, because the damage is incredibly well. And overall for the raid, Shadow is A tier in terms of the damage. But because it kind of has these little dips, once again, I decided to take the middle ground and put it around middle for the entire raid. But if you do play specs around B tier, expect that there will be fights where you will destroy and fights where you will just suck on a lemon. I don't know what to say, man. It is what it is. Assassination. Ugh, oh my god. Assassination is surprisingly A tier, but it's kind of... It's a little bit weird doing it into A tier. Assassination also is one of these specs that, you know, if you really want a lot of good boss damage, you got it. Thankfully for Assassination, if you want some cleave, you don't change too much. Actually, just change one talent to get cleave. You change Eternal Bleeding into Spatter, which is something that, you know, particularly works really well on Laradar, because you just have natural cleave for the ads. You don't even have to worry about it. Similar to Farok, although on Farok, I would imagine Assassination struggles a little bit more because the ads are so spread out and it's kind of hard to get to them. But even so, it's still ranked A tier on Farok by Archon.gg, kind of showcasing a little bit the potential in boss damage for Assassination. And in terms of overall raid boss damage, Assassination is among the greats. It's above average. It's close to Shadow. However, the reason it's higher than a tier than Shadow is because overall it is doing better than Shadow on pretty much all of the bosses where Shadow actually suffers. If it's not at the top end of the tier where Shadow is in terms of its damage bracket, it's at least one tier higher, which is why it's A tier. It's very consistent. It's not going to make S tier soon. A lot of A tier specs could be in S tier, like Unholy and maybe Feral, but Assassination is not one of them. It's consistent A tier because it has its ups and downs, but the delta is maybe, I don't know, maybe not that big. Outlaw, also A tier, I think with the same arguments as Assassination in terms of its overall performance. There are benefits to having an Outlaw that, you know, Assassination doesn't have. You're incredibly tankier. You're not as reliant on strict damage windows. For instance, on Smolder Run, Outlaw is doing just way better. This is actually something that I'm personally invested in because I've been playing all three specs on Smolder Run. I know Subtlety is better, but Outlaw does excel on fights where things get a little bit more difficult to actually perform in. Overall in the raid, Outlaw does more damage than Assassination in both AoE and, well, AoE, add damage and boss damage as well, which is why it's still higher. I don't see it in S tier because on Farok, in terms of the overall performance, it does really well on adds, which is where Havoc is, but Havoc isn't S tier either because of its a little bit lower boss damage. Like, the more we go into the season, the more we see the specs that actually do boss damage, good boss damage, they do a lot more. And going into the end of the season, that's usually what matters more because, you know, everybody can just kill ads. That's not an issue. Subtlety has been a consistent king. It still is consistent king. It might as well be the only S tier spec. If you, depending on where you get your information from, you're probably gonna be, oh, Subtlety is the only S tier spec. It's just OP. It dominates everything. It also has been nerfed last week, so you know, I don't think the nerf is gonna affect it too much. It's, you know, 6% eviscerate damage nerf. It's a nerf. It's a nerf for a finisher. It's not the best finisher. It's not the best damage in your damage profile breakdown, but it is a significant part that you cannot ignore. I don't think that will change anything that Subtlety does really well because you are spec'd into heavy single target whenever you're playing raid. However, you know, we all know that Secret Technique just does AoE damage anyway. Subtlety is just good pretty much ever. I don't know if there is a fight where Subtlety actually suffers. On Farok, in terms of overall performance, you know, you're not going to get a lot of add damage for Subtlety, but it is going to do a lot of damage, period. On Larodar, it kind of sucks. I think all rogues kind of suck on Larodar. It's really hard to maintain consistent uptime with the boss charging into the fire. At least that's personally has been my experience on Sub and Outlaw and Assassination. So I can imagine that. On Nimue, it's really good. I can confirm. I can back that up. Finally, I have some rogue know-how. But we're gonna move on to Elemental right now, and it's going to be A tier, kind of at the bottom, which is a little bit surprising because Elemental is actually not one of those specs you would think it does really well, because it's just like always kind of hiding behind the really good specs. It's consistent overall on Tindril. In boss damage, it does really well. It's in the higher upper echelons for Tindril specifically, especially on the boss damage. It kind of, if you look at the overall rankings, and we're gonna see a similar situation with Enhancement soon, on Tindril overall DPS, it's pretty low because a lot of people pad, and I don't think Tindril, this is also why I decided to look at boss damage, not overall damage, because otherwise that would tank a little bit of its overall placement. Actually, scratch that. We're gonna take down Elemental a peg. I don't know why I initially put it into A tier. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that it just destroys Council. But once again, Council is a little bit of an easy fight. I'm actually changing my mind. I'm going to be putting Elemental down into B tier. I don't know exactly where in B tier it is. Maybe I would probably feel comfortable putting it in front of Windwalker. Maybe, I don't know about mages, it's kind of like here and there with Elemental. It's consistent, it's close to getting into C tier, but it does have some fights where it's really good, and you do have the benefits of being a rage, and overall in the fights where it matters, it's above average, so I'm probably going to keep it into B tier for now. Enhancement, not in the same situation though. I will actually put Enhancement into S tier because it is really good. It does some of the its best performance on some of the fights where it matters most. If we look at Nimue overall performance, which doesn't have any pad, it's A tier ranked by Arcane.gg because it just does a lot of damage, and we know that that's pretty important for Nimue. On Smolderon, it drops off a little bit. I can see some issues with Enhancement having proper uptime, especially with its squishiness. Some specs can afford to be a little bit more risk-taking, let's say, than Enhancement would be. And on Larodar, it's still around A tier, close to S tier. But overall in the raid, not just good at boss damage, but also really good at overall damage as well. If you do play an AoE-centric build for an AoE-centric boss, you're still going to do really well with Enhancement, way above the bottom of the barrel. Well, way above the average bell curve rather, and it's going to be S tier. It's close to being A tier. I can see a comparison between Enhancement and Outlaw, but I think their overall performance has a big enough of a difference where I think they shouldn't be in the same tier set, or they should be tier set, tier list, tier level. but I think that should be enough of a difference to point out that it's not quite the same. Enhancement is really, really, really good. Affliction that I mentioned for so many times and hinted at in the past in this video, it's good. It's B tier. Now, you would think that going into Affliction, if you've never seen an Affliction play in the raid, you'd think, oh, this is easy D tier. Nobody plays Affliction. Affliction is pretty bad. Overall, if we look at the raid boss damage, Affliction is kind of at the bottom. It's slightly below the average, if not the actual average line, which is good. That's where B tier kind of is, if we just look at boss damage. Obviously, a lot of people have been seeing Affliction's fucking destroy Tindral. On Tindral, it is actually the holder of the most amount of raw DPS in the game, with Demonology very close next to it. Actually, I think at the recording of this log, there's one Demonology that did more than Affliction on Tindral, but that's like one person, right? But overall, the amount of AoE burst that it can dish on the roots is crazy, and it is propelling its overall performance in the raid, which is once again why it's not particularly great to look at, let's say, Archon.gg's overall distribution of damage performance and judge by that. Although they do rank it in B tier, B tier for them, I don't know, that seems to be below average. I think it's just about average. It struggles, of course. It has some issues with a lot of the bosses in the raid, but overall it's not as bad as people say. And because it has this niche, although it's not something that we value a lot on this particular tier list, doing the explosive AoE, it has value in the raid as well, since you can just have one Affliction and it takes care of pretty much of the entire ads situation, or maybe one more spec other than Affliction, and everybody else can just concentrate on boss damage. And I think that's a value that if you bring to the raid, that just elevates the entire group's performance higher, and you can have specs like Feral actually do really well and the boss actually get down quicker, because they don't have to worry about just doing AoE as well. Demonology, similar-ish, is also into B tier. Now, it's a little bit more consistent than Affliction. It's not as gimmicky as Affliction, but it just doesn't have incredible fights where it excels at. Overall on Farok, it is ranked S tier, which, you know, we all know it's pretty good, but that's just overall Farok damage. Because on the actual damage to Farok and on the boss, it is quite low. Actually, very dangerously close to being the worst spec, if not the worst spec, for Farok damage. That doesn't necessarily mean that it has bad boss damage. It's okay. It's actually pretty good across the board. Like on Smolderon, for instance, I think it's just average. It's the best Warlock spec on Smolderon for boss damage. Is B tier, close to the top end of B tier. So it has the potential. Most likely the way that the mechanic and the fight is being put out kind of makes the Demonology struggle because of its class design, not because of its potential to actually deal damage. And that's, you know, the back and forth once again is why we keep it into B tier, not put it into, oh my god, D tier because it's the worst boss damage spec, or S tier because it just does giga AoE. No, but overall, average is where it's at. Destruction, however, I will put it into C tier. So far, the first C tier spec and the worst spec currently in the raid in terms of performance, and I would have expected this to go to Affliction, but it actually goes to Destruction. Overall, in the raid, it has the worst amount of damage output out of all of the Warlock specs. Probably not too far behind Affliction, but enough. And also on Farok, it is the worst Warlock spec and close to being C tier on Farok. And considering it doesn't have amazing boss damage either on Farok, not to mention being overall C tier, B tier-ish in terms of overall performance in the raid, is why I decided to put it into C tier. It has its moments and that's great, but it doesn't excel that much. Arms, dude, I don't know if I'm biased, but every time I look at Arms, it's just doing way better than I thought, and it's rubbing salt in my wound because I did intend to main this. I just didn't like the tier set. The tier set has been fixed. Arms damage profile has been, you know, improved by quite a bit, and with the legendary as well, it does incredibly, surprisingly well damage. If we look at the overall Farok performance, Arms is S tier among everything, but then again, that's not enough to keep it into S tier, because overall in raid boss damage, it's also the 4th best spec in the game, really close to Unholy and Ret, but it's more consistent than Unholy throughout the raid, which is why Unholy is A tier and Arms it's S tier. Another reason why Arms is S tier and not A tier is because on Farok, even though it does pretty much amazing damage across the board. It is one of the highest damage dealing specs on the actual boss, which is a big difference from the other specs where they either do really good Farok damage or really good overall add damage and kind of suck on Farok damage. Because Arms can do both, not the best at both, but better than everybody else, is why Arms is S tier as well. It might have bosses where it struggles because, you know, everybody does. On Small Drawn, it doesn't seem like it. It is an A tier spec on Small Drawn for its overall damage performance. On Nimue, it's around A tier as well, drops a little bit more, but not particularly bad either. And on Larodar is S tier, most likely because of sweeping strikes as well, which is really good to have access to without having to lose single target, but boss damage still rocks for these situations. So Arms is going to be S tier, and I thought for sure that Fury would overtake it, but Fury for some reason doesn't seem to be doing as well as Arms, and that's definitely surprising because overall on Farok it is one of those S tier specs like the S tier boys. In terms of the overall raid boss damage, it drops a little bit compared to Arms. It's a little bit more consistent. Arms has been doing more damage than Fury across the board, period. Fury is, though, tankier, and that matters more on progress than on reclears and farms, which is what we're kind of getting into at the end of the season, where sure, it's great that you're tanky, but that's not as big of a deal anymore now that, you know, everybody has Giga Eye level, they're geared to the teeth, they have their defensives and all of that. And we're going to put Fury all the way into B tier. Now I'm just gonna put it randomly here. I don't think it matters exactly where it is. I don't think it's the top of the B tier spec, and one big reason is that sure, it does great on Farok. It doesn't do as good as Arms on Farok, but it really sucks on Tindral for some reason. Overall, in terms of like, if you look at damage to adds or overall damage on Tindral, the most Fury can do is still very mediocre or below mediocre actually, and the boss damage for Tindral is also mediocre. And I'm using Tindral this because it is a wall going into Farok, and although it does really good on Farok, it struggles so much on Tindral that I feel like that kind of earned its right to be knocked down a peg or two, since you can tell, right? You're not just gonna pick a spec and rank it S tier just because it's S tier on one fight. And even on Farok, I don't know if I would put it into S tier. I'll probably put Fury into like top A tier at best, but because it struggles a lot on Tindral, it's going to go a little bit down. Plus on the other fights, it's A or B tier-ish level, hence why it's B tier all around. I think it's probably most fair. Augmentation is the last spec in the list, and this is the hardest to rank because all of the data that we have on Augmentation when in terms of its overall performance is related to its damage. Damage is poor. We're not going to be able to look at boss damage. We're not going to be able to look at AoE damage for Augmentation because that's not what the spec is supposed to do. Spec is supposed to buff. The value that it brings is really good. I don't think it's as amazing as people might think or might want to make it be. I would put this confidently around A tier-ish. I don't think it brings the same amount of value to a raid as an S tier spec. It's really good, don't get me wrong. It's a A tier specs are nothing to scoff at. Just because it's A tier doesn't mean it's bad, but it's not where everybody would want it to be, especially now for some reason. We have augmentations in our raid and they do really well and they do help out the raid, but it's not like sub rogue level or Arms execute level or red giga boss damage level. It is decent, and probably the biggest reason why it's hard to rank Augmentation is because maybe it should have been a support spec. Maybe it should have been a healer instead of a DPS support. That would probably have been easier to kind of gauge its performance and its overall value to the group. But at the very least, you can watch the healing video that we made, because healing changed for World of Warcraft and we need more healers, and I don't know where all of the healers are, but what happened to healing in WoW?